Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to this ISW meeting, the first of 2025. And I noticed that we've got some new faces and new people who've joined us this evening. Very welcome and thanks for coming this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker for the evening, Simon Hanna. Simon he describes himself as a writer, activist, and trade unionist. Is a trade unionist with the Unison and is an official of his local branch. He's a member of Anti-Capitalist Resistance and he's written several other books, including The Labour Party, a party with socialists in it. And some people may remember that Simon came and spoke to us a year or more ago, precisely on that topic about the Labour Party and the nature of the Labour Party. So, welcome back, Simon, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us for this meeting. Simon is going to talk about his book, which has just been published, um, called Reclaiming the Future, uh, a beginner's guide to planning the economy, which sounds a bit of a dry title, but if you read the book, and I've got it here, um, if you read the book, it's actually not a dry read at all. It's quite an inspirational read, and so I'd certainly recommend people buy it. And I will put in the chat at some point this evening where you can buy the book from. It's dirt cheap, so it won't break any bank balances. So, but the content is brilliant. Um, Somebody's just joining us. I'll just admit them. So thank you very much. And Simon, over to you. Are you ready?
I'm as ready as I'll ever be, Paul.
Brilliant.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining tonight. And if any of you have had a chance to read the book or started reading it, then I'd really value your feedback on it and your insights. So the book, as Paul said, is Reclaiming the Future: A Beginner's Guide to Planning the Economy, and the book is really based in the idea that socialists need to be a bit more confident in talking about what a post-capitalist society might look like, um, and that we need to be able to articulate the general principles of how it might look, even if we're not particularly going to identify one model or another model or whatever. But we need to be able to convince people that we can move beyond capitalism. So the book is in a sense, part of a growing body of literature which is coming out recently. People are challenging the capitalist realism notion that Mark Fisher wrote about a few years ago, the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And so, how can we create space for creative thinking about what socialism might look like? Um, and this obviously has particular resonance because of the depth and scale of the ecological crisis. We don't have time to sort of waste just sort of trying to resist the worst aspects of late stage capitalism. We have to be able to build movements and organizations which can build social movements and trade union struggles and so on, but also be able to convince people and engage people in the possibility that we can begin to move beyond capitalism. So that's the basic reason for the book's existence. Um, I think it should go without saying that we are losing the argument globally, both that capitalism is the problem, particularly on climate change, which we'll come on to more in a second, but also for a lot of other social issues that we have at the moment: declining wages, worsening conditions of living. There's a new word in the Oxford English Dictionary last year called enshittification, excuse my language. But it's just the idea that things are just constantly getting worse, and sometimes in big ways and sometimes in like annoying, difficult ways. Like things that used to be easy, become harder. Things that we used to expect to be provided are no longer accessible unless you're rich, you've got money. So there's a general feeling of decline and things not going very well. But we're losing the argument for where the blame with that lies. And you can see the growth of the far right internationally, are doing very well at convincing millions, if not globally billions of people, that the problem is, say, migration or equalities legislation or transgender people or anything that is a marginalized group that they can point people's anger and rage against rather than the billionaires, the governments, the actual people who have wealth, money, and power to be able to making decisions over our lives. And the inauguration of the second term of Trump's presidency this week, and the scale and scope of what the Trump movement is trying to achieve in the US is frightening, and is also going to be a massive catalyst to similar politics deepening and expanding in other countries as well. So we have to take all this very seriously. It's not business as usual. It's not sort of we're just kind of muddling along, doing what we can. We're now in a period of capitalism in which the climate crisis is becoming existential. It actually poses the basis of continued life on the planet, and the growth of the far right forces, some of which are kind of fascistic, some of which are white nationalists, some of which are just kind of socially conservative, are going to be and already are a massive threat to growing numbers of people in different countries around the world. So, yeah, the basic argument of this book is that we need a vision of the future, a better vision based on human need, based on an idea of a universal concept of what it is to be human, within which, of course, the working class is central because most of us are workers, most of us are exploited human beings, and we don't have really much of a stake in the continued survival of this system. And certainly the system doesn't have much of a stake in our continued survival either. So I guess the feeling is mutual. But a concept of humanity which is based on a democratic vision of being able to organize society in a new way based on human need, moving past markets, moving past profit, moving past commodity exchange, and all of the reasons why that is so damaging on the planet. So the choice facing us, as Naomi Klein talked about in her book, This Changes Everything from a few years ago, which I recommend reading, she said that the scale of the what they're now calling the polycrisis, i.e. the overlapping crises that are happening, and the deepening of those crises is such that it is back to a kind of socialism or barbarism future. We either build a world based on, as I said, human potential and creativity and a universal concept of the good life for people, free of capitalism and all the exploitation that brings in, or we live in a world which is being formed before our very eyes of climate change denial, obsession with new technologies which are incredibly damaging to the climate, massive expansion of violent militarized police forces and borders, massive resurgence of racist, nativist, violent nationalist ideologies. And so we're really faced with a scissor crisis in that sense about the future before us. So one of the things I want to introduce in the book is the kind of obviously the criticisms of capitalism. So the first chapter is about what capitalism is and how it functions and what's wrong with that. And obviously, if there's people on the call that have been around active on the socialist left for a long time, these particular arguments will probably be familiar to you anyway. But the book is titled A Beginner's Guide to Planning the Economy, so it is intended at people who are interested in these ideas but maybe relatively new to them, because I think we need to be reaching out to new layers of people and not just talking amongst the circles of the existing left. The point of the book is that following Marx, that labor is exploitative under capitalism. We are not paid the value of our labor. The surplus labor that we produce is taken by the capitalist class and used to create profits and to expand their industries. The exploitation of people has a damaging effect on us, on our society, on our relationship to each other, on our mental health, on our communities, in our workplaces, obviously. We labor under a dictatorship of capital in the workplace. And there's also exploitation, not just of people, but also of planet as well. The same logic that necessitates the domination of humans in the interest of capital is also the same logic that necessitates the domination and destruction of nature in the interest of profits. Um, and capitalism is not sustainable with the environment. It is a system based on constant growth, never-ending growth. I mean, that's what Labour's policy is as well, of course. Just keep on growing the economy as much as possible, and using that to try and solve various problems, which obviously is an unsustainable thing we're doing. Sorry, this thing is making a lot of noise. Um, so the constant search of growth is literally incompatible with life on the planet, and that is built into capitalism. You cannot have a green sustainable capitalism because capitalism requires market growth, expansion, competition for it to function, and therefore is very wasteful and is very destructive of, as I said, like human life and also the environment. Um, One of the things I talk about in the book is the idea of the metabolic rift, which I know is quite popular recently. Is kind of in Marx and Engels in the 1800s in embryo, but has been developed and expanded more recently. This is the idea that humans are part of nature. We are not alien from nature. This is an important point because I think there's some green um, ecology politics, which kind of see humans as like a virus or something external to nature. And we have to reject that. We are part of nature. We rely on nature, but we're a conscious thinking part of nature. We've always been a part of nature that um, changes the world around us. We work the soil, the materials. We create tools. That's always been part of our development as a species. Um, and it's been relatively sustainable for most of human life. Not in a kind of Gaia-esque, we're in perfect harmony with the planet at all. I mean, if it's constantly changing and shifting, then it's not exactly a completely harmonious relationship. But nevertheless, we managed to sustain the environment and survive as a species for a long time. Capitalism, though, has shifted that to the scale and depth of what capitalism needs in order to create profit, creates what is called a metabolic rift. It's a specific rupture that capital causes. It destabilizes the natural cycles of the planet through creating over and under accumulation. So if you look at the example in agriculture, for instance, where capitalism first developed in England in the 16 and 1700s, it's the intensification of farming, the enclosures, the need to deepen the extractive base of the way that we use the soil. And then as capitalism develops, massive overuse of fertilizers and pesticides, huge deforestation, massive soil erosion. Um, all these things are built into the way that capitalism constantly drives and needs to extract from the planet. There's other things as well. You know, there's obviously the carbon cycle is overaccumulated in the atmosphere. That's the basis of the greenhouse effect. The consequences of global warming, the overaccumulation of that carbon, is the underaccumulation of glacial ice, for instance. So the metabolic rift is the way that these natural cycles become disequilibrated from each other. Some expand, some shrink, and this is one of the main ways that we're looking at how the planetary boundaries are being breached. So the kind of economic activity, as in the use of nature that we have as a species, has to operate within certain parameters. But capitalism has already breached, I think, 7 out of those 9 planetary boundaries. Some of them in incredibly dangerous ways. And so this is why, again, capitalism is a system which cannot survive indefinitely. So I'm sure we can, probably if you're on this call, then you probably already agree with quite a lot of that. The book goes on, though, to talk about the importance of building movements and social movements. You know, we can't rely like some Marxist theoreticians did in the Second International at the turn of the 20th century on just working class consciousness just snapping into place and suddenly millions or billions of people start fighting for socialism. That has not happened. It's about the way that we can encourage the development of a radical eco-socialist class consciousness in a struggle against capitalism, which is not just obviously an environmental struggle, but is also rooted in the other things that people need. So there's a great phrase where they say, the people causing the end of the world are also the same people that make it difficult to buy food at the end of the month. Your wages, don't sustain you for the whole month. It's the same problem. It's the same people in charge of the same economic system. And so the ways that we can think about building movements which bring in the broadest number of people around all kinds of resistance they might have is obviously it's a fight against police racism, it's a fight against low wages, it's a fight around some kind of democratic control over the urban environment where people might live. But it's also a fight around the environment as well. And so finding ways that we can link those things together to build broader movements and the way that eco-socialist politics can help not just clarify what's at stake in those immediate struggles, but also the future of those struggles. Like how can we try and move towards a more kind of anti-capitalist politics. So, and I think that's important because there's lots of books about, say, socialist planning, which start from the idea that socialism has already been won, and then it's just a question of how we reorganize the economy and society. This book doesn't start from that premise. This book starts from the basis that we are under capitalism. It is terribly destructive. There are movements and campaigns and organizations. There's also the history of socialism. I mean, we have had countries that called themselves socialist or even communist in the past. And so we need to think about how we root ourselves in the actuality of politics now, and how, if, say, there was a massive breakdown or a rupture in which there was a real revolutionary challenge to capitalism, how might we start from that point in terms of being able to rebuild society along a much more egalitarian, equitable line. So the book it is not an academic book in that sense where it just looks at different models. It is a call for action to try and help mobilize people, but also help people think beyond just the immediate social movement campaigns that we might all be involved in, towards how we can also articulate a vision of a different kind of society. So I use the phrase eco-socialism in the book. The basic point is that it's a world where we align human society, which includes all of our talents and abilities, in such a way that we bring humanity back into line with ourselves. We are not just alienated proletarians or, people cast on the scrap heap because there's no work for us, or whatever. We can begin to create a society worthy of what it is to be human. It can also bring us back into a rational relationship with the planet, healing the metabolic rift by beginning to plan production and distribution and exchange in a democratic way, which I'll come on to more in a second about how that will particularly help, but in a way that begins to massively reduce waste and some of the more harmful aspects of capitalism, how it functions. And it's also a system where we can begin to move beyond scarcity. One of the key arguments in the book is that capitalism creates scarcity. It's also a system of huge overproduction and waste. I mean, we literally throw food away. I think we throw away nearly one third of all food that is produced. But it is a system where we also live amongst terrible scarcity, and so many conversations we have with our friends or loved ones or workmates about whether we've got enough money to do this or that, or whether we can afford things, or the way that our lives are limited and stunted by the fact that we live in this condition of scarcity, while obviously some people are billionaires who will never want for anything in their lives. And so how can we begin to move beyond scarcity as one of the crucial aspects of the way that kind of impacts on our mind? So I think there's a very important point to make around scarcity here and how eco-socialism is different. Because if you think about scarcity, that's one of the main things driving the far right at the moment. It is a sense that, especially after 50 years of neoliberalism and over a decade of austerity, there is a feeling amongst millions of people that life is nasty, brutish, and short, that you shouldn't expect anything out of this life. You shouldn't expect anything from the state or any handouts or welfare. Everything is just, the neoliberalized individual fighting to survive with what they can. And of course, if you have that mindset and that logic, then that immediately leads people to really hate migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. Why? Because you your whole logic is structured by scarcity. You see things in terms of what the capitalist government can or cannot provide, and obviously Tories and Labour both do this. They say, well, there's only so much money to go around. We've got to make hard, tough choices. And then you read in the newspapers at how there's millions of pounds a week being spent on hotel rooms for asylum seekers, for instance, and that leads to a very simplistic but powerful scarcity reaction where you're like, well, how come they're getting all of that and I'm not getting things? Or how come I'm living in damp, bad accommodation with low wages and these people are coming from Afghanistan or like other places and getting all these, like nice hotel rooms and things. And so the way that scarcity works its way out and the way that that structures your thinking and the way that political demagogues like Trump and people like that will turn people against each other using these scarcity mindsets is one of the I think one of the most powerful ideological things that keeps capitalism going, but also one of the most powerful arguments for eco-socialism. Because if we reorganize the economy, then we can begin to move beyond the scarcity mindset. Obviously, we can't do it overnight, but we can begin to create a universal concept of human where it's not just that we're divided from each other based on nationality or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, all the other things that form our identity in constant war with each other over who gets what in society. Eco-socialism, I think, is also an important framing of a potential future society because we are trying to draw a distinction between the new radical forms of socialism and the old social democracy of Labour, or the social democratic movement and the mixed economy, which was something that really only existed for a few years after, or like a few decades after World War II. And I think one of the things that we need to be quite aware of is that the kind of alignment of things that led to the Attlee government and the mixed economy and the creation of the NHS and all these and the massive expansion of the welfare state, that was caused by what happened in World War One, the massive crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, and then World War Two, and a particular alignment of politics and economics that allowed that to happen. That is not the case anymore. The idea that a new Attlee government is going to be able to come in and just fix things like that is like that's just not going to happen. Capitalism is in a phase where, because of the neoliberalization of the economy, it is unwilling. The capitalists are unwilling to allow those kind of governments to exist because the Attlee government was successful in part because the capitalist class thought it was a good idea to have a mixed economy and social democracy rather than a revolution. And so I think we have to be aware that that model of the kind of laborism only existed for a few decades, and everything that's happened since 1975 has been about tearing that down and destroying it. So I think we have to be cautious about just wishing we could go back to 1948, for instance, because that was the product of a very particular moment in time. So we have to think about how things can be different in the future. Eco-socialism is also different to the Stalinist regimes. There might be some people on the call who think that the USSR was, a shining beacon of working class power. I'm a bit more critical of the USSR. I think that the initial revolution was good and changed world history. I do not think that the regime that was created after that, particularly in the 1930s and beyond, was really a very healthy form of socialism. And certainly, if we're looking at it from an environmental perspective, it was incredibly destructive as well. The Azov Sea being destroyed, Chernobyl, obviously in Ukraine. We need to try and think about how it could be better and different next time. Not to say that we throw the baby out with the bathwater or anything like that, but how can we imagine a new way of organizing an eco-socialist society, which isn't just trying to, again, replicate how things were in the 1930s or 1940s, for instance. So the points that I make in the book is that, and I don't really go for a particular model, as I said. I go in more for like the general principles of how these things will work. If we do want to generally move beyond capitalism and not just have another mixed economy system, what are the things that we need to do? So there's 4 things that I identify. One is to establish social control over investment and production. 2 is to institute a participatory democracy. 3 is to abolish the social division of labour. and 4 is the abolition of commodity production. So I'll explain these 4 things, and then I'll wrap up my talk. So the first one is establishing social control over production. This means abolishing the private ownership of industry and commerce. So this is the old socialist position of taking into public ownership the commanding heights of the economy. Obviously, in Britain, that would particularly mean the banks, but other, the supermarkets, the other big blocks of capital that exist in this country, that they would need to be taken into public ownership. I don't use the phrase nationalization because nationalization, I don't know if people have seen Ken Loach's documentary, The Spirit of 47. I think he makes some very good criticisms in that, it was the same management structures, it was the same managers, it was the same kind of hierarchy in the workplace. It was still run like a capitalist company, but it just so happened to be run by the state rather than by a private capitalist class. So I think we need to try and be a bit more radical about this and try and think about how we can socialize parts of the economy in a way which encourages different forms of organizing those industries rather than just the same top-down dictatorship in the workplace model, which kind of nationalization can sometimes imply. But obviously, this will be a huge legal shift. I mean, it'll be a huge, a massive change to begin to reorganize the economy mostly into the public sector. The second point I talk about, so establishing social control of investment production. The second one is participatory democracy. So socialization on its own isn't socialism. I think Engels makes this very good point in the 1870s when people on the German left were praising the kind of things that Bismarck was doing, because Bismarck was nationalizing parts of the German economy in his struggle to kind of build a strong, united German state. Some socialists were like, "Hey, this is great. This is socialism," and Engels is very critical of this. He calls it Bismarck socialism. Like, just because something is run by the state does not make it socialist. It can still operate within the capitalist economy. What we need to be talking about is participatory democracy within the decision making over the economy more generally. Who gets what, on what basis? How do we decide the distribution of resources between immediate consumption and more longer term investment? How do we have more workplace democracy? How do workers in their workplaces make decisions over what happens there? And how does that interact with wider society? Consumers. I think this is a big problem in the Soviet Union, is that consumers didn't really have a lot of say over the quality of goods. So lots of things would be made, but they weren't made to a very good standard. So we have to make sure there's good consumer control over things that are produced. So how do we talk about this kind of participatory democracy? And again, I don't have a particular model for it, but certainly I think that it's important that we really foreground that, because I think there were some socialist societies in the past that didn't, and I think that was a mistake. So the third thing I talk about is abolishing the social division of labor. This is simply that capitalism structures who gets what jobs, how much they're paid, how much respect they get in the workplace. We already know the social divisions of labor between jobs that men and women might get, jobs that white people and black people might get, jobs that you might get in one part of the country versus another part of the country, jobs you might get on a global scale. Nearly all of our clothes now are made by sweatshop workers in Bangladesh, a lot of them children. So whereas people in the West are more likely to work in offices and do sort of like intellectual labor, or non-manual labor, for instance. So capitalism creates this social division of labor and obviously divides us against each other and causes lots of divisions. And the point that we would be doing under a post-capitalist society is we begin to undo those social divisions of labor. We begin to dissolve those antagonistic hierarchies, the roles and jobs that people are kind of forced into or kind of boxed in with. We can begin to reorganize it in a much more democratic way, in which we begin to abolish the division between manual and non-manual work, or the kind of work that men and say women do. Say, women are more likely to end up doing caring roles, for instance, because obviously we have a sexist conception that women are, better carers, and therefore they should just do those kind of jobs, whereas men can go off and be, academics or, kind of manual workers, for instance. So I think that's important. And the final point I make is about the abolition of commodity production. This is crucial because if we're still producing things to be sold, and therefore wage labor is still commodified, then we haven't really got past capitalism. The commodification of work was one of the crucial changes from the old feudal system, where most of us were peasants working on the land, and then the enclosures were forced into the cities. All we have is our ability to work, and so our labor power becomes the only commodity that we have to sell to a boss in order to be able to survive. As long as we have that wage commodified relationship, then we haven't really begun to move past capitalism. And so, if we introduce a democratic social plan of production and distribution, then we can begin to decommodify parts of the economy. We can begin to move things away from production for exchange towards production for human need or social need. So, one of the great examples, obviously, in Britain, although it's constantly under attack, is the NHS. The NHS is, for the consumer, decommodified healthcare. We don't have to pay anything for NHS healthcare provision. Now, the NHS itself is not decommodified because obviously it has to exist within capitalism. It starts to pay the nurses and doctors and porters and everyone else wages. It needs to buy drugs from, pharmaceutical companies. So the NHS itself is not completely decommodified, obviously, but we experience it as a decommodified, universal form of healthcare. So we can begin to think about how we can expand that kind of principle for other parts of the economy. How can we begin to expand production or service delivery or public services in such a way that we increasingly can make them free for people, and then we can begin to think about how we can plan, say, for instance, a shift of taxation to pay for those things, but then also the beginning of, say, reducing wages, not because we're reducing wages to make people poor, but your wages don't need to be so high because everything is more and more things are beginning to be provided free. For instance, if all the buses and trains were provided for free across the country, then that becomes part of the social wage, and we're beginning to decommodify that aspect of society. So I think these are some of the crucial points the book is trying to make, because we need to be quite radical about how we can do these things. So I'll just finish quickly. There's lots of other things in the book, but I'm running out of time. I'll just say some of the ideas about how an eco-socialist plan of production based on democratic lines of social ownership can begin to help create a more sustainable relationship with the planet and heal the metabolic rift. So the first one is it will end overproduction. At the moment, production is done for market share. So we still have a thing where, despite the revolutions that Toyota put into the production system in the 1980s and 90s, say most car companies still overproduce. They just make cars, they can't sell them all, they're left to go, they sit in kind of massive parking lots to rust, and then after a few years they're destroyed because they couldn't realize them in terms of a profitable exchange on the market. So we have massive overproduction of things, including some parts of food as well. And so if we had a plan of production based on an understanding of human need rather than whether it could just be sold on the market, we can begin to reduce overproduction, which obviously is a crucial part of what is causing the metabolic rift and also the deterioration of the planet. We would end market competition in a similar way to the other point I just made. Things would not be produced for competition. It would be produced for human need, for social need. We also need to obviously challenge the idea that only competition creates new ideas and products. This is generally not true. A lot of new inventions come from the public sector, like universities, for instance, which aren't necessarily a kind of market competitive model in that sense. It's just based on people doing research into new, ideas and things. But then obviously they get snapped up as patents by private companies. So you have to challenge the idea, which obviously is quite popular now amongst lots of people, that say people like Elon Musk are geniuses, and their kind of brain is huge, and they're just coming up with all these great new ideas. It is not market competition that primarily creates new ideas, and so we have to really challenge that. If we remove the profit drive from the economy, then we can create space for production based on things that we need, not whether it makes profit. So, for instance, green technologies and renewable energies. At the moment, there is not a lot of money in renewable energy. There is not really a green transition happening on a global level in that sense. There is still so much money to be made from carbon, fossil fuel, extractivist industries that, yeah, like there's just not money being invested in that because, again, it's all about the profit. There was an example a couple of years ago where Shell shut down its green research and design division. Why? Because they said they had a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders and it wasn't making any money. And it might make money in 10 or 20 years, but obviously, most money that Shell makes is digging oil and gas out of the ground. So they weren't going to, as they saw it, waste money on something that might not be profitable. This is a huge aspect of what is driving a lot of environmental degradation. I'm sure lots of us have got mobile phones. Apple, in particular, are famous for, they actually introduce software into your mobile phone to make the battery life decrease. They bring in new software updates that if you've got an old model, then you just can't install them anymore. So it forces you to go and get a new phone. Clothing companies willfully destroy end of line goods, clothing, just because they didn't sell it and it's not in season anymore, which fills up landfill. So we would obviously stop doing all of that. We would stop making cheap single-use plastic rubbish that fills up landfill in oceans. We would also, importantly, if you begin to have a democratic plan of the economy, you can get rid of what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. These are jobs that only really function because they might be making profit for someone, even though they are socially not useful jobs at all. And I'm sure we've all done jobs at some points in our lives where we've just thought, oh, I don't know, is this job actually any good? I mean, it's just like, like, they're not fun, useful jobs, and they're not socially necessary jobs, but they're kind of jobs that are, making someone profit somewhere down the, like somewhere up the corporate ladder. And so, if we can begin to get rid of those bullshit jobs, as they're called, we can begin to redistribute work in a way which makes more sense, therefore reducing the working week. 27 hours, 15 hours, why not? And we can begin to then free up time for human creativity and potential, and for us to enjoy our lives and meet our friends and engage in culture and, like do all the things that make it great to be human rather than just slaving away as in a dead end, not very good job for most of your life. And the final point that I'll say, there's many others that we can say, but I'll just finish on this point. We would implement the what I call the Seeger principle. This is from Pete Seeger's 2008 song "If It Can't Be Reduced," which I recommend people check out. Um, he has a line in the song, I won't sing it, but he says, "If it can't be reduced, reused, repaired, rebuilt, refurbished, refinished, resold, recycled, or composted, then it should be restricted, redesigned, or removed from production." And I think this is a guiding principle for how we can begin to produce and make things under a post-capitalist society. But as I said before, all the reasons why, because capitalism is based on profit, built-in obsolescence, based on making things cheap that are disposable, and therefore we can't really have a rational plan of the things that we make because of the profit mechanism. And this is one of the main things that is driving the environmental destruction that we face today. So those are the key arguments in the book. There's some other chapters as well. There's a chapter on human nature, arguing against the idea that human nature is inherently selfish and self-centered. And there's arguments around some of the old anti-socialist arguments from people like Hayek that we need market economics and prices, otherwise the whole economy will just fail. And so that's the main. So there's chapters towards the end of the book which kind of deal with some of those kind of arguments against socialism, which I think are quite kind of common sense arguments. In other words, they are commonly held views, not that they're common sense in that they're good sense. And I think it's important that we, are prepared to have these arguments with people and to reclaim the idea that we can live in a more harmonious relationship with nature, with each other, that the future doesn't need to be controlled by the far right and the fascistic forces. We can reclaim the future from them, if we can find ways of articulating a better quality of life for everyone post capitalism. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that exposition of a vision and our desperate need to continue revisiting our vision of what we hope the future can hold for humanity. So thank you very much, Simon. We will now take a short break, but we will be coming back in 5 minutes or so. I make it nearly 10 to 8. So if we come back at 8 o'clock, so if we have a good 10 minutes, so we could have a break. You can unmute if you want. You don't have to go away. If everyone unmutes, then you can have cross conversations during the break in the same way as we would do if we were here physically. So please feel free to communicate during the break time. I am, however, now going to stop the recording. Could I please ask somebody to remind me when we come back to start recording again, because I often forget and I only discover it about halfway to, nearly towards the end. So please remind me. But anyway, we'll have the break now, come back at 8 o'clock, and we'll continue the discussion and a Q&A session, or however, what people want to do. Okay, so see you soon. So, okay, welcome back everybody to the second half of this meeting with Simon Hanna on reclaiming the future, a beginner's guide to planning the economy. And again, I'd like to thank Simon for his contribution. What I would like to suggest is if you put your hands up using the electronic thing at the bottom of your page where it says react, you can click on that and then click on the raise hand button. I don't know if everyone can see that. If you raise your hand, I notice Alan's already done it, so we've got one speaker, but I tend to take 3 people at a time to give maximum amount of participation from people. And then Simon, if you might want to respond to those 3 things, and then we'll take another 3. And hopefully everyone will feel able to participate. Particularly, sometimes people are a bit nervous on the Zoom event to participate, but please feel free to you're amongst friends, so whatever you say will be taken in good faith. So thank you very much. Alan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, just a couple of things really. I've just finished reading Simon's book, and I have to say I wish I'd written that one and not the one that I have just written, because it's a lot more comprehensive. I really couldn't recommend it more highly. But one of the things Simon touched on was the whole far right creeping fascist threat that we've got. And I have to say, I've looked around at the videos that we can see of the people that are showing their videos. And from what I can see, there may be 3 who possibly, because I can't see them, might be young, but the rest of us are not. And I think that is really worrying for all of the, Simon mentioned this concept of polycrisis, so many different crises that are, was it a chap called Albert? Did a Facing the Polycrisis book recently. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We're not reaching out to young people. There was a survey published in the Guardian just a few days or maybe a week or so ago, which I thought was very disturbing, that something like 20% of young people who normally veer towards the left of centre are now thinking that they would like the idea of a strong ruler with no elections to the idea of democracy. And of course, the problem is their idea of democracy is the hollowed out democracy that we've got with neoliberalism. So I think that's something we on the left need to address, and address it urgently. And the other thing I think we need to address, and picking up a point again that Simon made in his talk and he does in the book, if there's anybody who knows anybody on the left who can write fiction and could write a utopian novel along the lines of what William Morris did with his News from Nowhere, We absolutely need something like that to give a kind of encouraging vision of what life could be like if we just broke away from this economic system that's not actually been around for that long in terms of human history, you know. And what to finish with, I'm going to post in the chat for those of you that engage, that's the quite right word, on social media with your local Trump, Musk, Farage supporters. Some of them are getting a little bit uneasy about Musk's Nazi salute. And I've been doing quite a bit for the last few days, and it clearly is rattling their cages. Those of that who are not that committed to Trump and Farage and Robinson clearly see this as a bit worrying to be associated with something like that. And I've been pulling out all the stops, the links between Musk and the AFD, all those kind of things. So anyway, that's me done. Thanks again, Simon. That was a good chat.
Thanks, Alan. Nobody else seems to have the hand up at present, which is a bit worrying. Simon, perhaps in the meantime, suddenly the hands are coming up. Brilliant. Steve, if you want to unmute and coming next, and then Joseph. You need to unmute, Steve.
I endorse what you were saying, Alan, about the age question, and this was something I mentioned it a little earlier before we actually restarted, because in this event to support Mayotte, I was looking around and I thought to myself, within 10 years, most of us will have gone. And as I said, there were 2 or 3 people who perhaps were in their 20s or 30s, and that really is quite problematic. Now, one of the things that I discovered, although I should have known, in this book, the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, was the way that the Milton Friedman ideas had been developed over the decades, and then became sort of generalized, and a very interesting way that the Pinochet behavior and the shock and awe sort of got adopted by Thatcher, and because with the Falklands, and how that was followed up by the destruction of the miners' strike and so on and so forth. And this question of developing a vision that people can embrace, I think, has been very well pointed out by Georges Monbiot in a very good TED talk, a 15-minute TED talk about that is really worth seeing if people haven't. And also some of the other materials that he's come out with about neo-colonialism, neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. But it is this difficulty in a very shallow world of social media to try and get across complicated ideas. And I spend my life trying not to make people miserable and depressed and so on and so forth. I won't say with particular great success, but somehow this developing of a vision, and as I say, the way that Georges Monbiot puts it in this TED talk is really well worth looking at again. Simon, I think I'll have to get hold of your book, and thank you for the contribution, which I thought was very good and honest and so on and so forth. As one sees the potential of the Trump regime, despite Alan, the fighting that is clearly going on between the billionaires, the power that they're actually able to put in operation is, I think, very, very worrying. And I cross my fingers for us all. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Steve. Joseph.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just wanted to make a general point first, and then refer to one or two things that Simon said that are in the book. So the first thing is, for my sins, I watched Trump's online address to the Davos summit this afternoon, and it was blood-curdling. And what was even worse, I mean, he repeated a lot of the things he said at the inauguration. What was even worse was there was a panel lined up of the great and the good, all of whom were CEOs of various fossil fuel companies, banks, and so on, some from America, some from Europe, all presented as friends of Trump. And the questions they were putting to him were all about, the polar opposite of what Simon is introducing in his book. It was about deregulation. He had a swipe at the EU. Some of these European CEOs were agreeing with him, how can we get the EU to deregulate further? There were phrases used by Trump that will make Alan's hair stand on end, like good, clean coal. The oil company guy from Total was talking about, how they can increase production. I mean, it was just a nightmare scenario. And they were obviously hugely enthused by his election to think that they can do the same, in Europe and everywhere else. So it's a nightmare scenario. It's like, as I said, the polar opposite of what, Simon's ideas in the book. And this is the grim reality, I'm afraid, that we're going to be faced with. Two of the things that Simon mentioned, one was about, producing for non-profit and for good. I mean, a classic example of this was during the COVID pandemic, when AstraZeneca produced the vaccine at cost, which was then, sent all over the world. I know there were issues with a small number of people who had adverse effects from it and so on, but it did, the first two vaccines I had were AstraZeneca. It did save a lot of lives, and it was an example of a company for once, not going principally for profit. It was interesting that subsequently they were attacked by Pfizer, who are notorious in big pharma for dirty tricks, and of course, who bigged up the whole argument about AstraZeneca's products are dangerous for you, with the end result that most of the AstraZeneca vaccines were withdrawn. And again, this is an example of how big business will always use the dirty tricks. The other interesting thing was about, these useless jobs. I mean, one of the reasons that's being put forward for the huge increase in mental health problems among young people is shit job syndrome, which is where you have a useless, badly paid, boring job, which you have to spend, a huge amount of time working on, and which then produces, depression, alcohol dependency, and all the rest. So, I mean, this is a very real, apart from being a political issue, a very real medical issue, a very real economic issue. And a lot of those people subsequently just give up, basically. They just, they can't continue with this. This is, capitalism is bad for you, should be our slogan, really, I think. And the idea of common sense, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Simon mentions that in a left-wing context. But what is interesting is that Trump and the far right have actually captured this term and use it all the time. Common sense is the argument they use against, equalities, diversity, and all the rest. Common sense in their minds is like lowest common denominator, basically. But common sense has become one of the buzzwords of the far right and of Trump.
Thank you, Joseph. Simon, do you want to come back on the three contributions so far, and then if people could think about putting their hands up to speak, and we can continue the discussion. But Simon, over to you. You need to demute or unmute or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, thank you for those initial comments. And Alan, your book's great as well. Don't do yourself down. Come on. I recommend Alan books. Alan's also got a book coming out about eco-socialism, which I recommend. Yeah, I mean, we're in a, it is a bit of a challenging situation, I think. I mean, I think we're in the middle of a kind of a counter-revolutionary phase. Now, I don't mean that there's revolutions breaking out everywhere and there's counter-revolutions to that. I mean, there's counter-revolutions in the sense they are preempting the kind of revolutionary crisis, well, like preempting to stop the kind of revolutionary crisis that the climate is going to cause. The UNPCC and other organizations have put a estimate for how much global warming is going to cost, both trying to mitigate it and also trying to deal with the consequences of it. And of course, it runs into trillions upon trillions of dollars. No one wants to pay for that. No, Elon Musk doesn't want to pay for it. Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, none of these tech billionaires want to pay for that. And of course, there's huge question marks over whether capitalism can even pay for it. I.e., like if we still understand everything through the money nexus of what can be afforded or not, then yeah, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to do all the things that are required. So I think the big battle that is happening now is that who is going to pay for the climate crisis, and this is where the far right are very appealing to a whole bunch of people. I'd also recommend Richard Seymour's book that's just come out at the end of last year called Disaster Nationalism, and he makes the point that, which I largely agree with. I think sometimes the left or people on the left, or certainly some liberals, can come across as quite censorious and lecturing and elitist and sort of constantly having a go at people. And where people like Trump and the far right are attractive, especially to young men, is that it's just the politics of don't worry about it, just let it go. Don't worry about climate change, don't worry about equality, don't worry about not being able to say this or do this or whatever. And I think for lots of people that is a real sigh of relief. That's like psychologically freeing not to have to worry about these things. And I think unless we can find ways to articulate a good life for people, one in which people are free to do what they like to do within planetary limits and also in a way that's not hurting other people. We have to be able to put forward an attractive vision of society, and how we can be together. And the problem is the far right are succeeding at doing that. Obviously it's not our vision of what we want society to look like, but it is very attractive to millions upon millions of people. That's why so many people are voting for them. So yeah, I mean, I don't have any, there's no silver bullet answers to that, I'm afraid. I mean, I wish there was just a simple slogan or a new piece of analysis or something that we could put forward that would unlock the way to deal with it. I don't think there is. There's just going to be incredibly hard work to reach out to, especially younger people. And I'll just finish on this point. In particular, young men. I think. I mean, obviously everyone, but all stats from the last election said that young men 16, 17, if they could have voted, most of them would have voted for reform. And there's there's a bit of complacency on the left. We're like, oh, our generation messed it up, but don't worry, the youth will sort it out. The youth are always radical. The youth are always more left wing. No, not necessarily at all. The youth in Germany, most of them are voting for the AfD, or a huge chunk of them are voting for the AfD. Le Pen's National Assembly in France is hugely popular amongst people under the age of 30. So there's a lot of work to do. Like it's not just that, it's kind of conservative older voters who are, kind of getting on a bit. It is, these far right ideas are popular amongst young people. And so we need to find ways to understand that and begin to challenge it, because otherwise, yeah, it's going to be impossible to make the kind of changes that we need to make.
Okay, anybody else wants to come in? There's a gap in the meeting now for people. Mike and Derek. Is there a third person? Okay, Mike, if you want to unmute and come in.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sam. I really appreciate this. I've got a question that's kind of related to some of the points that have already been raised. It's to do with societal relevance. If unions aren't necessarily much of a vehicle for societal change, if social spaces are harder and harder to find and keep alive, what do you say are some useful forms of action to popularize, that regular people can take from where they are? What do we need to focus on popularizing? Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm sure Simon will come back on try and answer your question. Derek.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Usual things. It's been mentioned a number of times here. One of the big problems is, where is the money coming from? That's the wrong way to look at it, because any country with a sovereign currency can literally just print the money. You may say, well, that leads to inflation. Didn't do in COVID. It didn't do after the Second World War, etc. But it's the sorry, I'm not very well at work. It is the narrative of the far right and other parties that you can only spend what you can afford to spend, and that's bullshit. Absolutely bullshit. And I would say the other thing is that people say you need a strong economy to have good public services. No, you don't. You need good public services to give you a strong economy. And we've got it the wrong way around. And the reason, in my humble view, that people are voting for the far right is that every other party, irrespective of what the name of that party is, has failed to deliver. So they look for something else. And everyone who voted Labour in the last election, you've got a very shallow support for Labour. And many people voted Labour because the Tories had failed. Hasn't taken long for Labour to get into the same situation. They failed because they don't understand how money works. We've had people on here, Murray Mellor, talking about what money is. Richard Murphy talking about, a tax system, etc. The ideas are out there, but it's not the ideas that the far right, the capitalists want. Because it would actually, if those ideas were taken up and run with, then you would get the kind of society which was described at the start of the session this evening. Now, I'm going to have to stop there because my voice is going, and I apologize to people who know me, because you've heard me say this time and time again. I've just glanced now again, sorry, that the Labour is telling their MPs not to vote for the CAN bill. So they want to relax the environmental measures they wanted to take. Why? Because they can't afford them. Bullshit.
Thanks, Derek. Anthony, would you like to unmute?
He's still on mute.
I know, Anthony, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah. Have I got it now?
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you possibly say something more about participatory democracy? Do you mean getting more people to participate in the UK, the current system, or changing the system slightly, like with proportional representation, or make the House of Lords have a sort of citizens' assembly or citizens' assemblies in general? I'd be interested to hear how you'd like to get people to participate. Thank you.
Simon, do you want to come back? We've had 3 contributions.
Yes, I mean, just on Derek's point, first of all, I mean, yeah, I think that the Labour government is part of the problem. You know, I'm glad the Tories got beat massively at the last election. But Labour in government, despite the fact it's got an overwhelming majority, has it's been a complete disaster so far. And it's still wedded to that kind of neoliberal framework thinking about how, you know, money could be made or generated. And I think the problem is that I think that they're hoping that they can use what Tony Blair did. I mean, Tony Blair came in 97. The first 2 years of Blair's government did keep to the Tory spending plans, which I think some people forget. But then the world economy went into a big boom after 1999. There was a dot-com expansion. China got integrated into the world capitalist market when it joined the WTO in 2001. There was quite healthy kind of growth rates, and so the Labour government could siphon a lot of that money off in taxes and have massively boost the public sector. And I think that's what Starmer and Rachel Reeves are hoping to happen, but I just don't think it's going to happen because I think that we're in for years of stagflation. I think it's going to be sluggish growth. Inflation has still not gone away. We're in a much more low-waged economy than lots of other places. I mean, I work in local government. We've lost 25% of our pay in real terms since 2010. So we're all working a day for free, effectively. And I'm just not sure that, you know, we'll get the 5, 6, 7% growth that the government is desperately hoping to have in order to be able to pay for the public sector. So I agree that I think there's a real problem there in terms of what Labour's trying to do, and there's just a chance it will just double down on more austerity again, which would be an absolute disaster. And I mean, we can already see that in the opinion polls, they are right down. They're either 1 point ahead of reform or 1 point behind reform at the moment. That's the scale of the crisis, I think. Not that reform has got any solutions, of course, but, you know, people look for kind of convincing sound bites, and they've been primed to hate refugees and migrants over the last, you know, 20, 30 years. And so it just, like, that sounds like common sense. So I think within that, there's gonna be lots of discussions about politics, the next election, how we can put forward people's budgets and how we can fight for that. And how we can really challenge the capitalists and introduce actual anti-capitalist taxation, for instance, like on profits and assets, which Labour's refused to do. So, there's lots of discussions around that we can have. But I mean, certainly, I'm sceptical that Labour will be part of the solution going forward. On Mike's point, I mean, yeah, that's the £64 million question. Yes, I think neoliberalism obviously has eroded the power base of unions and shrunk the organizing capacity of working class communities and the left. I don't think there's any easy solutions to that. I do think people should be politically organized and active. I think that's just I think that's just the starting point. I think that we do have to think about how the left can work together and build something that's actually credible and meaningful in the next few years before 2030. Because I think that, the next general election is going to be crucial. But I mean, obviously 2030 is meant to be the big turning point in terms of net zero. So all the things that we can do in terms of the movements that we can build and the confidence that we can give people to resist and fight back. And I do think that there be lots of things that are going to cause fight backs. I think that's the thing. It's not that we need to try and encourage people. I think that there will just be things that will happen. There might be a mass movement around housing, for instance. I mean, there's a real crisis point around housing in this country and in other countries. Obviously, we saw the mass movement around Palestine emerge to try and fight back against the genocide there. So I think there's lots of opportunities to try and articulate a healthy socialist, eco-socialist vision. But it's going to be difficult, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of energy to be able to do that. I just find your Anthony's question. I mean, I don't, as I've said before, I don't have a model in particular, but I think that we need to encourage forms of democracy within our own movement, which can prefigure a more democratic society in the future. I think there's some things that the left does which can be quite undemocratic, even within its own movement, which I think we need to challenge. I feel that we need to find ways of articulating a society where there will be much more democratic decision making, both in workplaces and communities, as well as national and international levels. What we need to do is find ways of explaining that in a way which sounds really great and unalienating. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Brenda from Bristol back in 2019, I think it was, when a journalist went up to her in the street as a vox pop and said, "Oh, they've called another general election." She was like, "Not another bloody general election." I think there's a real problem that under capitalism, people feel very alienated from democracy because we obviously don't have real democracy. That's the problem. We have a distorted, twisted version of democracy because, as we can see in the United States, money decides everything. Power, wealth decides everything, and people are manipulated a million different ways to vote in different ways, and so on. So we need to, I think, get better at articulating what democracy will look like if it's stripped out of all of those things. It is particularly important, as people have said, because that poll came out last week saying 20% of people under the age of 25 would happily live in an authoritarian government where there was no elections. 1 in 5. So, so we have to challenge this kind of pessimism and this dislocation that we have from ourselves and our own agency. And yeah, and again, there's no easy ways of doing that, but I think we have to be aware of these arguments so that we can begin to challenge them.
Thanks. There's somebody who hasn't spoken yet, or is a bit anonymous. Petra, Craig, Anthony, Roy, who hasn't spoken yet, Sue, that wants to say something, Tony. If a hand doesn't go up in the next 2 seconds, I'm going to say something, and you don't want that to happen. Okay, no, nobody's hand's going up. I've got a question or a contribution, Simon. I think a really important issue about the future of what we mean by socialism is actually the commons. This idea of the commons, the commonwealth, which goes back historically to the diggers and what have you, the common treasury for all, that we all share this earth together. But we need to articulate that in 21st century terms. And I think it could, and you touched on this actually in your speech when you talked about the National Health Service, is one of the main institutions in our society which reflects that notion that our health is not for sale. It's not to buy and sell. It's something which we need in order to survive as human beings, and therefore our health service should be free at the point of delivery. And the health service remains, despite all its problems, the most popular of all our public services and institutions. And people still, although it's probably diminishing, this notion that the health service reflects what's good about Britain. And we need to articulate that, I think, in respect of other notions of public service, of other public services. And I want to combine this with the concerns about the lack of involvement of young people. I mean, what young people previously perhaps took for granted as the commons, things like free education, free higher education. I mean, when I was 18, I didn't think about loans or grants, or I mean, I got a grant. I studied at university, but that was a very short period in our history where young people at the age of 18 could go on to study at university. Not only did we get grants, but the whole notion that we have to pay for education. So I think that returning to this notion that education should be free for all, At the point of delivery, it's a fundamental human right, and I think that would be popular with young people. And it was popular, of course. Lots voted for the Lib Dems when they promised to abolish fees, but then they didn't. So I think we need to return the notion of free public transport. I don't remember as a kid paying for transport. But now my 7-year-old, I went into town with my 7-year-old in the last holiday by bus. I thought I'd take him by bus. £2 he had to pay. I was free. £2 there, £2 back for a 7-year-old. And a lot of kids are paying quite a bit of money for taxis, buses. So the notion of returning to free public transport, something that's a common good, take out the market mechanism from it. And I think these things could be popular with young people, but we've lost them. People now expect to pay for the other ones I wanted to mention. I think young people, despite their move towards the far right, in certain, some young people are still, broadly speaking, very much anti-racist. And Alan spoke about, referenced this in respect of a lot of people are very uncomfortable about Muscovy's Hitler salute. A lot of young people remain committed in a broad sense to our multicultural society. Most of their friends, cosmopolitan friendship networks at school and elsewhere. So they remain, and I think a society which threatens that would be popular with young people, that are real, but it needs to be popularized. It needs to become a common sense. And finally, women's rights. Young women, as we know through in the United States over the Roe versus Wade thing, are really concerned about their sexual rights to control of their body, and the way the far right, the essence of the far right is to control of women's bodies. And I think that again would be something which would bring more young people into us, but we need to make them high profile. Already Reform, for example, are talking about, or Farage is talking about abolishing abortion rights and going down the route of the United States. So these are touch points which I think would enable us to re-engage with young people. How we do that, I'm not sure. I think the issues are there, but we need to think about ways of how we do that. And I struggle with that. But anyway, there's just some thoughts on the commons and something issues which I think young people could be engaged on. And anybody else? Alan wants to come back. So Alan, you
is it okay, or does somebody else want to speak? Because I have spoken.
Yeah, nobody else has put their hand up. I keep
right. I'll be very brief. I'll sort of do bad news, good news. First of all, I want to pick up on something that Derek said about governments not dealing with the problems, and this is what worries me about the situation we're in now. Simon referred to it as a potentially counter-revolutionary situation. Historically, this is very similar to Germany in particular. Before 1933, a succession of governments didn't really effectively deal with the fallout of the Great Depression and all the other issues that there were. And in the end, enough people were pulled towards the Nazi Party. I think Trotsky it was who used the phrase that in situations like that, people are human dust. And it's up to the left to create a more attractive pole of, almost like magnetic attraction, if you like, to pull them to us rather than let them drift over and end up in the far right. And the good news is actually what you had to say, Paul. I think all of the things you said was particularly good, but the whole concept of the commons updated now to where we are and all the different things that should be part of it. Eleanor Ostrom, if anybody hasn't read her book, it's worth going. Or there's Derek Wall's book about it, which is called Rules for Radicals, which is a good exploration, where she shows examples of commons agriculture, whatever they might be, modern day examples that actually work. Kate Raworth, in her book, Donut Economics, also gives examples of modern day commons that are actually better than even ones that the state were looking at and trying to help, for instance, in some parts of India. And I think on the last point I'll make is to take up with those issues that you raised about racism, attacks on women's rights, not just on their control of their bodies, but the whole idea of equal rights for women at work. You know, that they are under attack by the far right. And I think if we can phrase it right, like you suggest, that is a way of pulling perhaps enough young people our way rather than let them drift off to the far right. That's me done.
Well, Simon, there's nobody else with their hand up. I'm going to give people the last opportunity. Nobody?
Sue's got a hand up.
Sorry, Sue. I was looking for the yellow hand, but you know, you're waving. Sue, you unmute.
I've probably just gone out my head now. What was the last thing that somebody said? I've just forgotten what I was going to say. Looking for
women's rights.
Women's rights. Oh no, what I was thinking about was about the young people. I think there's things around gender and sexuality that young people can also be really engaged on. But the public transport one is really good, because the thing that's hitting young people the hardest that I know is insurance, car insurance. They're paying over £1,000 for car insurance. It's horrific. And you link that into the notion of free transport, and things you're starting to get on that sort of those. But how you do it, I'm with you on that one. I haven't got a clue.
Thanks, Sue. I'm going to I think bring the meeting to close or conclusion. So Simon, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we'll go on very briefly to some notices from future ISW meetings and political events that are happening locally. So over to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I mean, I don't really have any more points than what I've already said. I thought that the it was a really great discussion, and it's really great to be in a Zoom call with people who are thinking about the big picture things as well, and how we can try and think more strategically and also positively about things. And I think that there is a battle for the future taking place right now, and I guess the final thing I'll say is that I think the reason why I called it Reclaiming the Future is because the left, the socialists, the Marxists used to believe that you have capitalism, and then the next thing after that is socialism, and therefore the future belongs to us. The future belongs to the massive working people in the in the broadest possible sense. Like everyone who is exploited, not obviously necessarily just waged workers, but anyone who's in that kind of socioeconomic situation, which is the vast majority of the planet. The future belonged to those people, and I think we can see it being stolen, like right in front of us, by these tech oligarch sort of pseudo-fascist, like far-right types. I don't think they're outright fascist at the moment, but yeah, I think Elon Musk's salute that he did was a nod and a wink to the to the base. I mean, they know they've got Nazis and white supremacists and ethno-nationalists in their ranks. So to do a salute like that is clearly a sign or like a signal to try and appeal to those people. Obviously, it's got plausible deniability. Of course, I didn't mean it like that. Like, what are you talking about? But of course, they're not going to come out and say, yes, I did the Nazi salute. They're going to come out and do the Nazi salute and then deny they did the Nazi salute. That's the whole way that alt-right functions. So we are in that, we're in a very dangerous situation. As I said before, it's not business as usual. And so we have to we have to have these conversations with each other in a positive, comradely space where we can begin to think about not just the resistance, but moving forward and building a better society. So I'll finish on that.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Please stay online. I'm just going to finish the recording now, but then we'll return to some business. It shouldn't take too long, hopefully.